And welcome back to Devlog. In the last part, I worked on momentum and sliding up and down slopes, and in this part, I work on adding bouncy objects and handling adding force from them to the player.
So bouncing itself, wicked easy, but it has some subtle nuances to its design and how it works. The way bouncing works is very simple, is we have bouncy objects. They detect when the player gets in range of them, and then they have logic for if the player can bounce on them. For example, an object you can jump through, like the mushrooms, will only have the player bounce on them if the player has a negative y velocity. This means the player is moving down. If the player jumped through an object, then they won't actually bounce on them. Actually, that's a complete lie. The mushrooms will trigger the bounce anyway, but for example, maybe a trampoline surface, if you jumped through it, as in you're underneath it, you're jumping on top of it, you jump up, you have your regular momentum, and then you fall back down, and now that you're falling down, you will trigger the bounce animation and you'll be able to bounce on this object. This is one override a bounce object could have. Another could be enabled or disabled. This could be if an enemy has a bouncy point on them. For example, if the enemy has a bouncy point on their head, but they cover it. This would then be enabled and disabled because the player cannot bounce on the enemy's head at certain points. But realistically, bouncy objects are very simple. You just bounce on them if the player hits on them, and there is some checks to make sure the player can correctly bounce on them. But for the most part, they're pretty simple. Once the player has bounced on an object, we'll check if we want to redirect their speed or add to their speed. For example, maybe a ring in mid-air that's a magical ring. This could be a booster, so instead of redirecting our player's momentum, we are going to add to their momentum so long as they are facing the correct direction, but if they're not pressing the correct direction, they will be forced in that direction. For example, if the ring would push the player to the right and we're moving to the left, when entering this ring, we will instead be redirected to the right, but if we're already moving right, it's just going to add to our already existing speed. After this, the movement is incredibly simple. It's just the player has momentum added to themselves. They will automatically move with this momentum as they do regularly in the game. Easy peasy. Number go up. Move fast. There's really not a whole lot of nuance or intricacies to how the actual force is added to the player. I just make the number change, and then I add an adjustment value for the player, so immediately after boosting, they cannot really do much actions. They can jump, they can do dashes, they can do maneuverability actions, but for example, if a player was boosted while on ground, they cannot instantly turn out of the boost 0.5 seconds after boosting, because this could perhaps be an error because we have just boosted, and also you're moving too quick. Just don't try and turn immediately after hitting an object. The same goes for aerial maneuverability. We're not going to check if the player can change their direction or they won't have much control after boosting. Just because it's such a sudden movement, we don't want any errors. We then check for turning, or we do that beforehand. This is really simple. If the player moving left and getting boosted right, they will turn right. If the player is moving right and boosting left, they will move left. It's very simple. I just make the player turn if they're moving in the opposite direction. And finally, we play the boosted object animation effect. This is the object we boosted on or bounced on. This is the object we bounced on. We play its animation and visual effects. In this case, it is a funny mushroom. It's boosted upwards and it plays a particle effect as you are bounced off it. What an interesting design. I wonder if I'm going to talk about it for 7 minutes straight. So, regardless of visual appeal, the mushroom that you bounce on is actually a 2D sprite. This is to have the mushroom match the player's visual design, while also being able to be rendered in a 2D sprite system, so it can be more stylized and hand-drawn. However, I'm a big dumb stupid head, and I redesigned the player's visual appeal this week. So the mushroom doesn't match the player, but luckily all I have to do is edit the textures for the mushroom and I can make it visually match the player once again. But for now I will just talk about the model and how that makes it easy. So the model is just a squish dip mushroom. This is so it can be animated. I think it's a very pretty mushroom. What do you think of the mushroom? It definitely matches the sort of naturey, natural aesthetic that I want to go with some levels. This would be fitting very heavily in maybe a forest area, or maybe a witch's cabin that you navigate through, or something of this nature. Mushrooms are just pretty cool, but it's basically a squished up model, and then I draw the texture on to make it look a lot more hand-drawn. There's no real lighting being applied to this, and this is mostly just so I can have the textures controlled and the lighting controlled by how I want to draw on the textures. You may be asking, hey, why even make a 3D model? Why not just draw the mushroom? Since that's clearly what you want to do in the first place. And the reason for that is that I'm not good at drawing. Anyway, so I draw the texture on the mushroom based on the one angle that is currently being viewed from, and then I just stylize it to match what I want. This is currently matching with a 2D drawn painted style, which I pivoted away from, so I'm going to redraw this in a 2D toon style. At some points, shrug, maybe. But this definitely shows up how the mushroom is visually appealed in the game. I basically just render these out as sprites, I edit these somewhat, and then I can use this as an animated sprite in the game instead of a 3D model. This is partly because it looks nice and I can edit them a lot easier as sprites, but also if the game is using a lot of sprites, I can add a whole lot of detail in the drawings that I wouldn't have to do in the models. This saves on time in rendering in-game, because without a bunch of high complex models, the game runs faster, and also it's kind of easier to just draw in little details in sprite sheets in opposed to adding the little details to the model. It may be a bit trickier to add them to the model, and it's just a whole lot easier if they're already sprites. And the final reason for making this a 3D model instead of a drawn image that I just drew myself is because I'm no good at animating in 2D. So actually animating the mushroom bounce and deform as the player lands on it would be a bit too tricky for one of me. So if I animate this in 3D with the rigged version of the drawn mushroom, I render this out as a sprite sheet of the mushroom bouncing, and then when I come to edit these mushroom models in Photoshop or another image editing program, I can much easier draw on the visuals of the bouncing mushroom because I already have the reference of how the mushroom deforms and moves in 3D. This is a really convoluted way to animate something, but it's my game and I can waste time if I want to. We then had the mushroom bouncing animations. It's the part of the devlog where I talk about animation for a really long time. These are currently reanimated. Originally they were in the 3D model, now they're in the 2D model. I really hope the current me who's editing this video made the animations for bouncing of the mushroom, otherwise I'm going to sound quite silly talking about these when they're not even finished yet. But these are 4 different animations for if you are bouncing up, right, left or down. And by 4 I mean 3, because left and right are just mirrored. Oops. I was originally going to have these being poses the players blended between, but it became way too complicated to animate each of these animations and accommodate for any level of blending based on the direction you are being pushed between. For example, being pushed diagonally upwards and right would have a blend between the upwards and the right animation, but as you can see, the animations for being pushed in different directions are completely different and wouldn't blend between very well. So it made more sense just to make 3 separate animations, and while there may be some visual nuance lost when the player is bouncing in an upwards and right direction, they will be more detailed animations. So I think this is the lesser of 2 evils. The animation has less complexity in which direction you are being bounced in, but the animation itself can be more complex visually. Now I know what you're saying, why not just make a diagonal boosting animation? I probably should have made a diagonal boosting animation. Anyway, so the animations are being boosted upwards. This is your character squishing out very tall, so they are going upwards. Whole lot of squash and scratch in this animation. This is your character squishing around. This character, if you are not familiar with them, I made specifically to be squishy and stretchy, so they bounce around a lot in the animations. This is shown a lot in the boost animations. It's them hitting the panel, squishing down, and then stretching very high up and boosting upwards, and then falling back into our regular air fall pose. The same is for the boost down animation. This is you stretching downwards, but you're tilted, and then you tilt regularly. You change the direction, so this is you being pushed head first into the ground. I sure hope I don't put a bounce pad right by the ground so the player lands head first onto the floor and dies instantly. The player is boosting headfirst downwards, they tilt and then they return to their regular falling animations, and then these boosting side animations. Mwah, chef's kiss. This animation I'm a really big fan of. I think it reads very well, I think it looks very fun, I like it a lot, it's a good animation. The player is boosted right, they're having their player model stretched again, and they're doing a nice little front flip. Here's an animation tip for you. If you add a flip, a back flip, or a front flip to any animation, it's good. It's just a good thing to do. Add a bunch of flips to your game. Do it! And then these animations have their own animation events. For example, the front flip has a nice little whoosh sound that is played as the player is flipping, just to have some visual audio feedback as the player is moving. I'm realizing now that maybe doing an entire devlog about boost pads and mushrooms was perhaps not needed. Maybe this all goes without saying. Maybe, just maybe, this is the most redundant, obvious devlog I've ever made.
Hope you liked the video. Bye.